Hey guys, welcome back to Strength Coach Basic Training. We are in week 6 of the program, and today we are going to talk about being a principle-based strength conditioning coach as opposed to a philosophy-based strength conditioning coach. There are a lot of philosophies of strength conditioning out there, and it's hard to pick which one you most closely identify with, because you'll start to pick things from each philosophy. But it's also almost a religious type of fight out there on which philosophy is best. And I just never really bought into that. And so I base my program purely on principles. And today we're going to go over that a little bit. But before we do, I want to tell you a little story about when I was being interviewed for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers by Mark Asanovich. So when I was being interviewed by Mark, one of the things that I took from that interview was the first question he asked me was to define strength. He asked me, "You want to be a strength coach?" Yes, sir. More than anything, I want to be a strength coach. And he asked me to define strength. And luckily for me, he had a phone call on the other line and had to click over. So I'm sitting there flipping through books and notes and everything, trying to come up with a good definition of strength. But at the time, I really didn't have a good one. I'm sure I probably defined power or something along those lines, but um, it was good enough. I got hired by the Bucks, but at the end of the day, what it taught me was that there wasn't going to be anything in my program that was not defined, and that I knew exactly what it was. And if I didn't understand it, then it wasn't going in our program. And so what I've done is taken the principles that I use in our program and provided them for you. But before I do, I wanted to read this quote to you because I thought it really applies well. It says, "Do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in anything simply because it is spoken or rumored by many. Do not believe in anything simply because it is found written in your religious books. Do not believe in anything merely on the authority of your teachers and elders. Do not believe in traditions because they have been handed down for many generations. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it." And that's a Buddhist quote, but it really is fitting in that. I mean, there's going to be a lot of things that you read. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to be rumored and speculated to have unbelievable success. There's going to be a lot of things that I'm going to teach you, that others are going to teach you, that may be out of date by the time you see this. Um, but at the end of the day, if you, after your observation and your analysis, and you know that it's benefiting the athlete, then throw it in your program and stick with it. If you've heard me speak, you have seen this slide. Um, I speak quite a bit, and this is one of the slides that I'll throw up there every presentation, and I'll talk. And when I give it, it's a one slide deal, and I move on. But I often say that this one slide I could speak for hours on, and this is my chance. This is my chance to kind of to take this topic and break it down, and to speak that hour on this slide. So these are the 10 principles that I base our program on, and we're going to get into these in a little bit more detail. With overload, to increase muscular size and strength and aerobic and anaerobic capacity, a muscle or energy system must be stressed with a workload that is beyond its present capacity. Effort must be great enough to exceed this threshold for muscular fatigue to trigger an adaptive response. The bottom line is that your body wants to remain at its current level, and you have to stress it past what it's capable of doing for there to be a neuromuscular adaptation. And so I like this picture because it's obviously an overloaded truck here, but your body has to be stressed past what it can do, or there is no growth. And so all these programs that you go in and you just kind of go through the motions, I don't agree with. For there to be something, you're either getting better or you're getting worse. That happens every time you enter the weight room. So the guiding principle of our program is overload. There has to be an overload that occurs. After overload, it becomes very simple. You got to progress past that point. The cardiorespiratory system and the muscles, they have to be overloaded with work that is increased steadily and systematically throughout the course of a strength and conditioning program. So if you can do 50 pounds a day and you get your target reps, then you're going to move up. Even if that 10th rep or that 12th rep or whatever it may have been is the hardest thing you've ever done. You're shooting for a new goal the next time, but you're increasing that stress. If you continue to perform the exercise at your current level, you'll stay the same. You'll adapt over time. And so you have to progress and you have to see progression in a program. Whenever I'm evaluating a program, I'll pull these principles out. And the very first two things I look at is, okay, how are we overloading the body? Once we overloaded it, where's the progression? And making sure that I see a progression. So what are some things that you can do to progress? In the weight room, very easy. You can increase sets, you can increase reps, you can decrease the rest intervals, you can increase the number of exercises. So if I'm doing a 4 exercise workout, I can increase, we're doing 4 sets, I can go to 5 sets. If we're doing 10 reps, I can go to 12 reps. If we're taking 40 minutes, I can try to do the workout in 30 minutes. Or I can just simply go from 10 exercises to 12 exercises. Out on the field with conditioning, all those same things apply. But now we're going to look at increasing the number of drills. We can increase the yardage, and we can also use various overspeed and overload protocols. So, balanced development. I tell our athletes every time they cross the sideline, they expose their entire body to injury. And so we have to train the entire body and prepare for the rigors of competition. So that's not just specifically selecting out a couple of key muscle groups and training those and saying, well, because we're training this, we're training another muscle group. We don't focus just on one area. We make sure that we train the entire body from head to toe. So the 5 major segments of the body are the neck, the hips, the midsection, the torso, and the arms. We want to make sure that we cover each of those areas. Never do we walk on the field and say, okay, we're just going to use our hips and legs today. And an example we often give our athletes is a kicker. Kicker's always, why do I need to train upper body? Well, tie your hands to your side and try kicking and see if you have the same type of power or the same types of transfer of power as you would if you were using your upper body. So we break that down. In the neck, you got your flexors, your extensors, your lateral flexors, and your traps. In your hips and legs, you have your glutes, you have your quadriceps, you have your hamstrings, you have your abductor-adductor complex, which is often missed. You have your calves. In your midsection, you have your different abdominals, so your transverse, your rectus, your internal, external obliques, and then you have your low back, your erector spinae. And then in your torso, you have your upper back lats, your pecs, and your delts. And then lastly, you have obviously in your arms, you have your triceps, your biceps, your hands, and your forearms. Excuse me. Now, when I evaluate a program or when I look at our program, I want to make sure that I provide a multiple joint movement and a single joint movement for every major muscle group. So now some areas, you can't do a multiple joint movement, flexors, your neck. That's a single joint movement. So it really breaks it down as to what you can and can't do from a multiple joint and a single joint fashion. But if you can train in both, you need to train in both. I often give the example of the squat. A lot of people use the squat just as a catch-all, and because we squatted, we trained our legs a day. Well, when you squat, you use your glutes, you use your quads, you use your hamstrings, you use your adductors, and you use your calves. Now, if there's a breakdown in technique, what is it? Is it because of the glutes? Is it because of the quads? Is it because of the hamstrings? And if you don't go back and you train that in a single joint fashion, you won't understand. You won't know. But if I come back behind and I do a quad, if I do a leg extension and my right quad is flying up and my left quad is lagging behind, I know that there's a deficiency there. There's a muscular weakness. If I know, I can also tell if there's a huge discrepancy between a leg extension and a leg curl on the the ratio. So going back behind and training those things. I often tell people that a torn tricep or a torn bicep hurts every bit as much or affects every bit as much the play as a torn hamstring or a torn quad or whatever it may be. Most of the times, those types of injuries are going to put you on the sideline. Next, you got perfect technique. All right, this is the foundation of all strength programs. You have to do your exercises with perfect technique. The goal is perfect reps in everything we do. Now, there's 3 phases to a lift. You got the concentric, all right, the raising of, or the positive part of the lift. Once you've raised it, you want to momentarily pause. What a momentary pause does is it basically shows that you've minimized momentum and that you've lifted and controlled the weight. If you're just throwing it up there and momentum's introduced, anytime momentum is introduced into a lift, it releases the tension on the muscle. So it becomes like a rubber band. You're going to stretch a rubber band. You're going to stretch it out. You're going to stretch it in. And over time, that rubber band is going to snap if you keep contracting, not contracting, contracting, not contracting. So you want to keep that tension on the muscle, and by doing that, the order of recruitment, you're going to recruit your slow twitch, fast, intermediate, and your fast twitch muscle fibers. After the momentary pause, you want to focus on the eccentric part of the lift. Because of momentum or because of gravity, you can lower a tremendous amount more weight than you can raise. And so to accommodate for that, you either have to lower the weight slower or you have to put more weight on the bar in the eccentric part of the lift, to continue to keep that tension on the muscles. So the ideal rep, the perfect rep, is typically a 1 to 2 second concentric contraction followed by a 3 to 4 second eccentric contraction with a momentary pause in there. That's what most consider an ideal repetition. Now, the next principle, reversibility. This is a very important principle to throw in your program, mostly because you have to educate your coaches on the importance of training. The principle of reversibility basically states that if training is terminated for a sufficient period of time, so more than 96 hours, the body will begin to return to its previous level of strength. If this termination of weight training is conditioning is lengthy, then the athlete will gradually lose strength until he or she returns to their pre-training level. So basically, muscles or your conditioning system is use it or lose it. You have to train. A lot of times you get the coach that comes downstairs and says, okay, well, we got a big game this week. I really want to win this game. This is a huge opportunity for our program. And it's week 2, and they want to back off. And then the next week, that game's important because now you're maybe 2-0, and that game's important, and you want to get to 3-0, and then the next week's important. And all of a sudden, you've not trained, or maybe once or twice in 3 weeks. Well, this principle right here states, obviously, that you're becoming detrained over time, and it happens quite often in the end season, that where by the end of the season, you are very detrained and very susceptible to injury because of a lack of training. So, whenever I sit down with our coaches, I make sure that we go over this and that they understand this is a major part of the lifting. This is a major part of the program. And that we have to continue to train. Now, will we adjust volume and intensity? Sure we will. But they have to train. There has to be a stimulus there. If you've been out of conditioning for any period of time, you've broken an arm, and after 6 weeks of 8 weeks of not using that arm, you take that cast off. You've seen some atrophy there, or some weakness, or you've taken some time off and then you go out and you run. You can feel that right away. You know what I'm talking about. So, very important that we place this in our principles. Specificity, and I this is a principle of mine, but I hate the word specificity. I wish I could use a different word. But the law of specificity basically states that you're doing the exact skill or not at all. So we want to make sure that we're training our athletes specifically for the sports that they're participating in. But these exercises, there's a whole market of exercise equipment that basically shows, you doing a similar type skill and trying to transfer that to it, like throwing a weighted football. Um, that's specific to enhancing arm strength. Well, anytime you throw that in there, it becomes a new skill. And, when you try to mimic those sport movements, it places a lot of undue stress, orthopedically. It also creates a new movement pattern, and so you're not transferring what you're trying to accomplish. The law of sports specificity is basically the concept that exercises and resistance used result in training adaptations that transfer to better performance on the sport or daily activity. Now, there's several ways that we make our program sport specific or athlete specific or you know, position specific. One, the very first thing we do is we manipulate the work to rest ratios. That's the easiest way. We want to concentrate on the predominant metabolic energy system used in sport. So obviously our cross country runner, we're going to train them a little bit differently than our offensive lineman when it comes to work rest ratio. Next, we want to make sure that we include exercises for the primary joint actions. Okay, so a skill like maybe a golf swing or shooting a free throw or something along those lines is more single joint oriented than the multiple joint sport of action of tackling or blocking. So we want to make sure that we're incorporating the joint actions that are specific to that sport. Now we're going to train in a total body fashion, but we're going to place a higher volume in the areas that are going to be most common to those sports. We want to make sure that we include exercises for the injury-prone areas. All right, so obviously, like an ankle sprain is very common in football. Common in a lot of sports, but we're going to throw some stabilization exercises, some anterior tibialis and calf exercises in to help make sure that we're addressing potentially injury-prone areas. The neck is a prime example. We train the neck in football. It's a very competitive, very violent sport. So we want to make sure that we're training the neck to prepare them because that's also the most catastrophic injury in football, a neck injury. So we want to make sure that we're training that. We want to include exercises that are specific, that are for specific skills. So ball handling, basketball player, they're going to handle the ball quite a bit. So we're going to want to make sure that we throw some exercises in for their wrist and forearm and their grip. That's going to help them hang on to those ball, to hang on to the ball. So we throw, some rice exercises in, or some wrist rolls, or some plate flips, or something along those lines. We want to include conditioning drills that are specific to the sport, in terms of the straight ahead speed, the change of direction, and their stance. So a baseball player is not ever getting down in a 3-point stance. So we're not going to condition them in a 3-point stance. Linemen, we are. Obviously our 100-meter guys, we're not going to do a whole lot of change of direction with them simply because they run in a straight line. So we're preparing. Our job is to prepare them for their sport, to enhance their genetic potential, but to get them ready for their sport. Lastly, the program itself is gonna be sport specific in terms of the number of training days and the evaluation performed. Some sports, just by their sheer nature, basketball, when they get into the season, they're lucky to train 2 days a week. Football, we're going to play 1 game a week, So, golf, they may have a tournament and not have a tournament for 2 weeks and then have another tournament. So they may have 3 back-to-back. So just the number of training days is going to make it specific. And then how we're going to test those athletes also becomes specific to the sport. Supervision. Supervision is critical, both coach-led and player-led. You know, I'm a firm believer that you have to provide accountability to your athletes. By providing this accountability, you're ensuring that what you're asking them to do and what you're prescribing for them to do is being done. You can write the best program on paper. You can have the best program in the world. But if you do not get them to do it, it does not mean anything. It really doesn't mean anything. So you have to make sure that you're holding those athletes accountable. So supervision requires experience. It requires practice, a general knowledge of strength and conditioning principles, and most of all, enthusiasm for what you're doing. We want to make sure that we're ensuring the following when we conduct a training session. One, we want to make sure that the reps are being performed properly. If you're prescribing with the NCAA, you in the offseason, you're only given 8 hours. So if you prescribe an exercise, bench press, and they're over there and they're doing the whatever shuffle, the icky shuffle on the bench press, and wiggling and trying to, using their back, using their legs, well, they're not doing the chest. That may be the one multiple joint movement you're doing for the chest that day. And so it's important that when you prescribe an exercise for a specific area to meet a specific need, that it's being done that way. And that it's not being done with momentum and jerking movements and exposing the athletes to some orthopedic stress. You actually want to make sure that they're doing the weight that they're supposed to be doing and that they're doing it at the proper intensity, that they're working hard, that they're pushing themselves. You got to know what buttons to push. You have to figure out what motivates the athlete. Motivation is an art form, and you have to maximize and learn several different ways to motivate athletes. They all have different buttons that are pushed. Some athletes I'm gonna talk up their high school or talk up a rival high school. Some athletes I'm going to talk about their goals of going and playing in the NFL. Some athletes I'm going to talk about working hard for their family. Whatever it may be, I'm going to find a way to get them going. You want to make sure that they're following the proper progression. You walk into any high school gym in the country, you're going to see, that athlete doing 135 for 8, 185 for 5, 205 for 3, and then they're going to max out. Every time they go and bench press, they're going to max out. But if they're not following any kind of a systematic plan or a planned progression, then they're not going to have a whole lot of success over time. And most importantly, you have to provide a safe training environment. Again, as a strength coach, you don't get to get caught up in everything. You have to make sure that a guy that's taking a plate off isn't putting it on the rack where they're going to slip on it, that they're putting it back, or that they're putting the equipment back where it needs to be, or that they're doing the exercise appropriately, or they get the right spotter, or they're using safety collars. All those things are important. Now, as a player-led part, you have to educate them on what their responsibilities are. In most of your situations, you're going to be one or two coaches for several athletes. And so you have to teach your athletes what's the responsibility that they have during spotting. If you don't, they're going to be over at the water cooler, they're going to be hanging out with their buddy talking about whatever they did last night. But if you take time to educate them on their responsibilities, then you'll have a very productive training session. So you want to make sure that they understand that they have a requirement to understand the sense of time, where they're at in the workout. 4 sets, with 4 guys should take about 16 minutes. If they're over 16 minutes and they're only on their 3rd guy on the 4th set, then they know that somebody in that group needs to know that they're behind. And that they need to encourage their athletes to move quicker through their transitions. They also have to have an idea where they're at target reps and weights. Now, the lifter themselves has that responsibility, but when they're under, what's this guy under right here? 345? When they're under 345, they're struggling. That goes out the window fast. So you got to push them through. Hey, you got 3 of this last week. Hey, you're on 3. You're on 3. Let's go. Let's get 4. Let's get 4. Let's get better. You find a way to push them through that and know where they're at. If you don't know where they're at, then you're just going to let them rack it whenever they get uncomfortable. You got to make sure that you're helping them set proper seat settings. The exercise changes if it's not consistent. You also want to make sure that the athlete's breathing correctly. You never want to hold your breath through a lift. This guy looks like he's holding his breath a little bit. But you never want to hold your breath through a lift. And so, just encouraging proper breathing and then expecting the tolerance for physical discomfort. That's going to be uncomfortable. Pushing an athlete past where they want to go and overload progression, that's uncomfortable. The person as a spotter has to expect that and encourage against it, And the best way for that to happen is to train hard themselves. If they're not being taught and training hard themselves, they lose credibility as a spotter, as a lifting partner, and it makes it difficult for them to push their partner, And that's when you end up having poor lifting groups, and that's going to directly affect your training session. Okay, next is periodization. Periodization is a planned, variegated training program where changes are made to ensure long-term development. Now, I get athletes for 4 to 5 years, sometimes less. If I just sat there and constantly tried to go on an upward slope with them and did not account for recovery and did not account for super compensation and things along those lines, then they would fizzle out pretty quick. And so you want to plan a program to where you're accounting for some recovery days, some lower volume or lower intensity training. Doesn't mean that you don't still go to some sort of fatigue, but you gotta change up the stimulus. So in our program, we look at a year as a macrocycle, a mesocycle as months, and a microcycle as weeks. And so we're going to plan out the entire year so that they understand what their goals and expectations are, and and the different areas that we're trying to hit and focus on at different times. Goals of periodization. Basically, you're going to go through all 4 of these phases. You're going to want to improve muscular endurance. You're going to want to improve muscular hypertrophy, which is increased size. You're going to want to improve muscular strength, and you want to improve muscular power. And to improve endurance, you're going to use light to moderate loads with high volume for about 60 to 72%. And perform to failure and do it with little recovery because it's gonna take you longer. For hypertrophy, we're talking more in the 67 to 85% range. And reps between 6 and 12 reps. For muscular strength, you're talking 80 to 90%. And we're talking anywhere from 5 to 8 reps. And muscular power, we're talking 1 to 3 reps. And somewhere between 90 and 105%. So you're going to work through a phase to where you're working up to that muscular power, and then you're going to recover, and then you're going to come back and you're going to work back through it, so that you're working on different areas of strength and adjusting your volume and your intensity accordingly. And by doing that, what you're able to do is you're really able, by focusing on the volume and by focusing on the intensity, you're able to make it so that the program is very individualized to that athlete. 65% for me might be different than 65% for you. And so it helps to understand that as you're going through and having that plan. I walk into too many weight rooms where the coach just writes something up on the wall, and that's the workout for the day, and there hasn't been any thought or any kind of understanding as to why it is what it is. Make sure you're planning your workouts. All right, evaluation. We are going to make sure that we test so that we make sure that what we are prescribing is accomplishing what we're prescribing. Secondly, it also gives good feedback to the coaches as to where these athletes are in their development. Now, the testing protocols and the fitness components are going to change from sport to sport. But for the most part, all of our sports, they will use these 7 different evaluation areas to address to test. Now the test may change, but we're going to make sure that we do this. So for muscular strength, it's the amount of force that a muscle or muscle group can exert against the resistance for 1 repetition. I like doing 1 rep. Some people don't. I like doing 1 rep because I feel like there's, that if you feel like you don't have it and you've got the proper safety precautions in place, you're going to be able to effectively get out of that without a bad situation. If you're doing multiple reps, you're going to start to introduce momentum and compensation patterns and things along those lines. I think that you introduce some issues. So, we're going to use muscular strength. We're going to test usually upper and lower. We're talking a bench, a squat. We're going to talk, deadlift, incline, leg press. Again, whatever it may be. For local muscular endurance, we want to basically find out what the ability to persist in physical activity to resist fatigue. So we're going to test things like the sit-up test, bench press test, or push-up test. With a lot of our sports, with football specifically, we use the combine test for these areas, and we'll test the 225 rep max, for this area. Aerobic power, if you're dealing with an aerobic sport, we're going to use some VO2 testing, the beep test or a 2-mile run or something along those lines, something that's going to get into that aerobic energy system. For your anaerobic power, we're going to look at anything that's less, brief, maximum effort, less than 2 minutes. So, a 40. For baseball, we'll use a 60 or a 30. And things along those lines. For agility, the ability to stop, start, change direction of your body movements in less than 10 seconds. So a variety of agility tests already exist with some normative data that you can use. We use the 5-10-5. We use the L drill. For some sports we use the T drill. Things along those lines that we can use and compare with our athletes. Speed. We're going to use obviously the 40, the 30, the 60. I misspoke here with the aerobic power. The aerobic power, we're going to use tests like 16-110s, 300-yard shuttle. Those, your 40s conditioning test. We're going to use a variety of conditioning tests to test that. For speed, we're going to use the 40, the 30, and the 60. And then lastly, body composition. All of our athletes are going to use some sort of body composition measure. We're either going to use the Jackson Pollock 3-site link caliper, the 7-site, or we have access to a bod pod, so we use the bod pod now. You might use DEXA, you might use bioelectrical impedance, but we're always going to get some kind of a register as what their body composition is. Lastly, the last principle is variety. I call it the spice of life. You got to have variety in your program. That's the bottom line. For these athletes to come in here 4 or 5 years, it's not rocket science. I mean, the principles aren't going to change a whole lot. There's only a certain number of exercises for like a multiple joint shoulder. There's only a certain number of exercises you can do for a multiple joint shoulder. So what you have to do is you have to change things up as best you can. So for us, we use different modalities. We'll use barbells, dumbbells. We'll use cables. We'll use kettlebells. We'll use body weight. We'll use manual resistance. It doesn't matter. Whatever we can provide a resistance to the exercise with. We have a couple of sand-filled water bottles in our weight room, where it's just water bottles that you can take off the water cooler and fill up with sand. And I tell recruits all the time now, I can take them out there outside with just that water bottle and have them hating life in about 5 minutes. I don't care where the resistance comes. Your muscles, they don't have eyeballs. They don't know if you do 1 set, 2 sets, 3 sets. They don't know if you use dumbbells, barbells, or kettlebells. All they know is that you've reached overload. You've reached fatigue. Obviously, throughout the year and from year to year, we're going to change up the workouts. We're going to make sure that it's somehow, some way, it's different. You know, we're going to use a variety of different workouts, and then we'll cycle those through as we see fit. Next, we change the order of the exercises. If we're in a 4-week cycle and we're going through and it's getting somewhat monotonous, we'll just throw an exercise in front of another exercise, or we'll change the order. We'll start from the back up. We typically try to do our multiple joint movements first, and then proceed to our single joint movements. But just changing up that a little bit, we'll add a little spice. Next, we change the execution of the exercises. Whether or not we're going to do it bilateral or independently. So if we're doing it with bench press with both arms, with dumbbells, or we might do it with one arm, or we might do it alternating. Again, just changing up something as simple as the execution will help. We introduce a lot of overload protocols. Again, it's time over attention type principles, but within that 40 to 70 seconds, we'll do maybe 4x4s, where we're doing 4 together, 4 one arm, 4 the other arm, 4 together. Or we'll do negative accentuated, where we're doing a 6-second negative and we're only getting 8 reps in. Or we'll do crazy 5s, where we're going up in 5 seconds and then holding for 5 seconds and then down in 5 seconds. Again, just changing the stimulus so that it's or the execution, or the add a little variety to the workout, so that you change things up mentally, because mentally is as powerful as anything. And then lastly, we throw and introduce quite a few different types of workout finishers. We'll throw wall sits for time, or compete on some lift that's in our workout, whether it's pull-ups. We might do a team competition with pull-ups, or we might do sled pushes, or sled drags, or tire flips, or sledgehammer slams, or anything that you can think of that's just going to get kind of a conditioning effect, but also I'm walking out of here knowing I worked hard, but it was something different, something that we don't normally do. But all those things help to create a great program. But like I said, it all comes back to these 10 principles. When I sit down and I evaluate that program, if you sent me your program and I looked at it, I'd pull this out and say, okay, how are we overloading? How are we progressing? Are we balanced development? A lot of times the neck gets missed here, or abductor-adductor complex gets missed here. What are you doing to make sure that perfect technique's being addressed? How are you coaching? Are you training within every 96 hours? Are you being specific to the sport you're working with? How are you supervising it? What's your plan? How you evaluating it? And then is there any way that you can incorporate some variety to this without compromising what you're trying to do? All those things are important to a successful strength and conditioning program. And my principles may not be your principles, but my principles are supported for what I do. So I encourage you to go out and you basically identify the things that you believe in, and then hold yourself accountable to that. When all these gurus and things out there, these guys out there for the combine prep and all those times, they come out with all these neat things, like the battle ropes, a really neat thing. I like it. I wanted to know where it was going to fit into our program, and where does it fit into these principles? And for the longest time, it was hard for me to kind of fit into this. But I ended up being able to fit it into our as a warm-up for upper body lifts and a little bit of grip work, and I was able to overload it, progress it with time, and fit into that balanced development. I started figuring out what the technique was, and we put it in our program. But there's a lot of things that don't apply. And if you stay true to your principles, when those things come about, it's easy for you to say, "Well, that fits or it doesn't fit, and this is why." And if not, you're just going to be everything that's gizmo or new that comes out or novel. You're going to jump on, and you're going to eventually get to a point where you don't even recognize your own program. So hopefully this helped you. This is again, this is something that I hold very dear to what we do here. Um, and I want to make sure that we have a very principle-based program as opposed to that philosophy where I feel like I can walk into any gym, any coach, and sit down and talk shop, and we're going to agree on a majority of these. We're going to agree on having to overload. That's an exercise physiological principle that you can't dispute. We're going to agree that you have to progress. We're going to agree that you have to train, for sport. We're going to agree that you should do it with the right technique, as opposed to going in there saying, okay, well, I'm a conjugate, or I'm a high intensity, or I'm a linear periodization guy. A lot of times you're gonna run into some conflict with that. So hopefully this helped, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care.